Welcome to Aspen Falls, a foggy and quaint little town in the Midwest you've never heard of. You've just moved into a house left by your grandmother you never knew you had. But creepy things are afoot in your new house, and both Aspen Falls and your family lineage are home to dark secrets that have come clawing at your door. What happened to this town? What happened to your family? And what the hell is up with all that fog? Now, to its credit, Stray Souls is an action horror game that's trying to fill the hole left in the psychological horror genre by the absence of a new Silent Hill. It has all the hallmarks you'd expect: moody atmosphere, a cursed town, a deep backstory, and monsters galore. But can it match up to its many inspirations, or has it gone astray? Now, it's certainly a horror game, but Stray Souls feels like it's not quite sure what type of horror game it wants to be. Or maybe during production, the goals shifted and certain issues were discovered without enough time to change them. To say that Stray Souls feels uneven is an understatement. Its initial haunted house premise, with jump scares and light puzzling, quickly gives way to a full-on guns-blasting approach that dilutes horror with action. Unfortunately, Stray Souls gives way to an entirely different sort of horror. It's not just bad, it's surreally bad. But before we get into how Stray Souls goes, well, astray, let's take a look at what it does sort of well. The story is actually intriguing, with plenty of written notes and diary entries to flesh out the nightmare infesting the game world. These moments were some of the game's strongest, especially when I found myself picking up notes in a foggy, haunted area, foreshadowing what's to come and ratcheting up the tension. It also helps that the voice acting is fairly solid, most of the time. Monster designs are a strong point as well, with some creepy, multi-limbed nightmares out to kill you. In fact, the overall visual design for the world feels impressive given the small team, with some great environmental effects such as howling rain and a heavy shifting fog that permeates most of the game, especially the forest level, all of which is quite striking and atmospheric. Overall, the game's environments are nicely modelled and detailed, the caveat being that several people familiar with Unreal Engine development have pointed out many of these are tweaked store assets. On the gameplay front, combat is also straightforward and competent enough, functioning as a simplified third-person shooter. You only get one weapon, an occult relic that can kill anything thrown your way. You aim down the sights to shoot and can dodge roll to avoid attacks like a pro. Sprinting may not be fast, but it's faster than the monsters, giving you more than enough room to move during encounters. With that out the way, where does Stray Souls go wrong? The answer is, sadly, with just about everything else. Despite an intriguing premise, the story ends up being poorly told. So much so there's an actual text file you can find in-game which provides a synopsis of the entire plot, as though the developers realized at some point that they hadn't told it well and decided to help you out. Sadly, this proves all but vital to understanding the background mythos and many in-game events, as the game barely makes mention of elements like ghostly possession otherwise. This poorly structured and incoherent design also applies to character behavior. For instance, when Daniel first experiences paranormal events in his home, instead of running straight back out the door, he heads to his computer to tell Martha, a girl he met on a dating app not 5 minutes ago. Later, when Daniel goes ahead on his own into a spooky forest carrying the only weapon, leaving Martha behind and defenseless, he calls her and tells her about the monsters that have just attacked him, and she responds by telling him to just keep going, and she'll meet him at his destination. Mind-boggling moments like these permeate the game. When the characters aren't splitting up for bizarre reasons, Martha often pops in and out of existence, her disembodied voice continuing to have a chat with you while traversing the environment, until a cutscene ensues and she's suddenly standing right next to you. I mentioned the voice acting is fairly solid, but the script and cutscene direction is not. Another issue is combat, well, not actually bad, simply isn't challenging. The only difficult section was the first boss fight, and that wasn't all that hard to begin with. The rest of the enemies, including later bosses, pose almost no threat, making several gruesome and intimidating designs feel all but pointless. It's difficult to be scared of enemies that move like decrepit mummies, and you are sometimes more interested in exploring the corner of a room than actually eating you. Another notable issue is that if you run from enemies, they seem to explode once reaching the limit of their patrol zone. Amusingly, this doesn't affect them individually. Only one creature from the group needs to reach that trigger to initiate a group self-destruct. It makes no sense, and given how effective the dodge roll is, it gives you little reason to fight when you can just cheese each section this way. It's just another issue that feels as though it was never fixed and instead got workaround, like how later levels fog lock you into small areas until all the enemies are dead. Oh, and on top of these issues, there's also an occasional bug that prevents you from aiming and shooting that can pop up in just about any combat sequence. Lastly, there's the animation. the gloriously awful animation, especially for the faces. These are often simply outstandingly laugh-out-loud bad. Daniel's facial expressions often make him look like a fish out of water gasping for breath, especially when something scary is in his way. In contrast, Martha loves to yawn at inappropriate times, or, when exposed to something nasty, look like someone has just lit a firecracker next to her ear. These terrible, over-exaggerated animations aren't only reserved for idle animations, they also pop up in major cutscenes and dialogue sequences. With all that said, there's a catch. As bad as Stray Souls objectively is, it was still entertaining in that B-grade, so bad it's good kind of way. Much of the game had me laughing for all the wrong reasons, but I still was entertained and compelled to see where the journey would go. Once I got into the mood of the game, and not the psychological horror vibes the developers had intended, I found myself engaged despite all its ridiculousness and gameplay missteps. Make no mistake, Stray Souls is bad, but it's entertaining and kind of fun all the same. And honestly, I'm worried too many patches to correct these issues might actually be to its detriment. While I would have preferred proper closure to the story, it feels more like a setup for the sequel, I still found myself invested in the outcome and, dare I say it, I became fond of the hilarious animations, especially those wild idle ones. They quickly became part of the game's sort of janky charm, and while I may not revisit it in the future, I can't deny it was a bit of a blast to play as long as it lasted. If you've got this far, please consider giving the video a like and maybe subscribing to our channel as it helps us grow.